welcome to Games as Lit 101. Today we're taking on one of the most beloved video games ever made. It's not my personal favorite game of all time, but looking at it objectively, it may very well be the best. It's on a very small list of games that I think are just about as close as a video game can get to being absolutely perfect. I am, of course, speaking of Portal. Portal began its life as a game called Narbocular Drop, an independent game made by a group of students from DigiPen Institute of Technology. At DigiPen's annual career fair, Valve developer Robin Walker was intrigued by the game, and offered the team an opportunity to show their game at Valve and get some advice. Upon that presentation, Gabe Newell immediately offered the entire team jobs at Valve. The result was about 2 years of work going into this little game called Portal, which was released as part of the Orange Box, a collection of Valve games. And despite that collection containing both the legendary classic Half-Life 2 and the hopelessly addicting Team Fortress 2, Portal was far and away the star of the show. The critical reception of this unique new puzzle game was overwhelmingly positive, with players, critics, and designers alike forming an immediate obsession. The game was shockingly original, surprisingly hilarious, and had one of the most creative new puzzle concepts since Tetris. And that positive reception has continued to this day. Portal is one of the most influential and beloved video games ever made, and certainly one of the most important of the last decade. Honestly, it's been analyzed to death already, so I'm not entirely sure that I'm even going to have anything new to say about it, but in any case, as usual, this show is going to take on Portal specifically in regards to its story and how it's told. Now, this analysis is going to be a bit different from past ones, most notably in that Portal, unlike the other games we've looked at so far on this show, isn't that thematically strong. That's not to say it's weak, there's just not too much to talk about. The story's pretty simple. There's not much of an ideological struggle or moral point, and there's no symbolism or anything like that. It's just a simple and enjoyable story. But the way it tells that story is rather masterful, and deserves being looked at for a good number of reasons. So while we will talk a bit about the story and themes of Portal, most of this episode is going to be talking about how it utilizes the first-person perspective, projection protagonists, environmental storytelling, and even tutorials as a major element of its narrative delivery. But first, of course, we must go over the story itself. As always, spoiler alert, and there's really no excuse on this one. The game is really cheap on a number of different platforms, old enough that your computer can probably play it fine, and only takes like 4 hours on the first playthrough, and even less after that. Add to that the sheer amount of influence this game has had on gaming culture and development, and you have a game that you really should have played by now anyway, and should certainly play before watching this analysis. So then, with all that out of the way, let's dive right in. Portal begins with you waking up in some kind of testing facility. A mechanical voice explains the basics of what's going on. You're part of some kind of testing initiative, and you'll be helping this facility with some experiments. Fair enough. Though GLaDOS, the AI who's speaking to you, seems kind of...
For your own safety and the safety of others, please refrain from... Stand back.
Glitchy. The game introduces you to its base mechanic, portals. A hole in some surface, be it a wall, floor, or ceiling, that connects directly to another, allowing you to bypass obstacles and transport yourself across large distances. The initial challenges are simple, consisting of portals acting on their own and tasking you with figuring out how to get from point A to point B with what you're provided. Then it gives you the portal gun, which allows you to place one of the portals yourself, before eventually granting you the ability to place both portals as you see fit. And so it goes for most of the game. Really, there's no real plot development from this point until probably about 90% of the way through. Nothing explicit, at least. But regardless, this is actually where the story of Portal starts getting interesting, and where its use of environments to tell that story really starts to shine. It's nothing new for visual storytelling mediums to use visual cues to communicate important elements of the story. In fact, it's all over the place in film. It's such a basic practice we probably don't even notice it most of the time. When the camera just shows us a character's face when they hear some important news, or shows something from behind the bushes, or even shows us the entirety of a couple's married life with almost no dialogue at all, the story is communicating itself entirely through the visuals. So this concept of visual storytelling is nothing new. That said, like most established storytelling techniques, it does change a bit in an interactive context, mostly because you're no longer framing the exact visuals to point something out to a viewer. It's up to the player to notice and explore something. It's still quite similar in that you are creating the visuals in such a way to point out, overtly or subtly, an object or something like that that bears relevance to the story, except that it's done in this case by allowing the player to explore it rather than framing the exact visuals to point it out to them. So then, Portal has no major narrative movement throughout the majority of the game, but believe it or not, much of the story is still embedded in this segment. Some elements are minor details, such as realizing the player character is a woman, but some have much larger implications. The most obvious is that this voice seems to regard you with a level of apathy, like you're just a tool for its experimentation.
You're doing very well. Please be advised that a noticeable taste of blood is not part of any test protocol, but is an unintended side effect of the Aperture Science Material Emancipation Grill, which may, in semi-rare cases, emancipate dental fillings, crowns, tooth enamel, and teeth.
Any promises of reward seem kind of like a token gesture.
The experiment is nearing its conclusion. The Enrichment Center is required to remind you that you will be baked, and then there will be cake.
As the game progresses, GLaDOS graduates from apathy to being cryptically threatening.
The symptoms most commonly produced by Enrichment Center testing are superstition, perceiving inanimate objects as alive, and hallucinations. The Enrichment Center reminds you that the weighted companion cube will never threaten to stab you and, in fact, cannot speak.
The game is brilliantly written, so this is all presented with a lot of dark humor, so it never really feels truly dark or foreboding, but it's still a bit unsettling. The fact that no one talks to you except this AI doesn't raise any red flags at first. You are, after all, in a scientific experiment that seems to be run by this entity, so there's no reason you'd have to interact with anyone else. But then you might notice that there are many observation windows throughout the test chambers, and no one is in them. It's a sign of life, but there's no actual life to be found. But then you notice a wall panel has been forced out of place. You move aside the blocks in the way and step into a room that immediately strikes you as far less clean and maintained than the rest of the facility. But you also notice that it looks lived in. There are empty cans of food strewn about, and there's writing all over the walls, sketches of the cameras and the turrets that threaten you throughout the facility, and cryptic messages about the omnipresence of the facility's AI, scrawled on the walls as though the writer was in a crazed frenzy. This is also, of course, where one of the biggest memes in gaming history was born. There's a lot we can infer from this information. The facility was clearly made for people, but there are no people around. Was there an accident? Is this AI just stuck doing her duty, not realizing that the people behind the experiments are no longer there? But considering that room you found, is there still someone alive here? An escaped test subject such as yourself, perhaps? Or a scientist who stuck around after whatever happened? It's the kind of information that teaches you more about the setting and the story, but still raises even more questions than you had before, which places Portal pretty firmly into the mystery genre. It's slowly feeding us more information that raises more questions, making the central conflict of the story our simple lack of knowledge, to be solved, of course, at the tale's climax. This is what's so great about Portal's environmental design. While Act 2 of the story doesn't have any major developments in the plot, it almost exclusively uses the visuals and environments to let you piece together the details. This forms a coherent mystery story that you're left to piece together through your own exploration and reasoning, all because they embedded these details into the environments for you to discover and explore. Portal is far from the only game that uses its environments to tell the story like this, but it is an excellent example. This kind of environmental storytelling is part of what made the first BioShock such a masterpiece, and it's even used to almost the exact same effect in the first Halo game. So keep an eye out for this. I think you'll notice it a lot more often than you may realize. Eventually, you get to the final test chamber, and GLaDOS thanks you for your service, before the platform you're standing on begins to lower into an incinerator. Which, if you've been paying attention, isn't all that surprising. But it seems her tests prepared you a bit too well, as a bit of observation and a risky portal jump get you safely out of the way. GLaDOS doesn't take well to this, but also can't do much to stop you, since you're effectively outside her area of influence now. And here, about 90% of the way through the game, is where the gameplay finally gets its chance to really shine. See, believe it or not, most of the game up until this point was basically one giant tutorial. Oh, you didn't realize that? Perfect. That was the point, and it's kind of brilliant. One of many storytelling challenges unique to the medium of video games is the simple fact that you need to teach the player how to experience your work. No one needs to tell you how to sit down and watch a movie or read a book. All the skills necessary have been taught to us as part of functioning in our society. But from chess to Halo to football to solitaire, games have rules that extend beyond our knowledge of basic everyday skills like reading or watching images on a screen. And to make it even worse, every game has a different set of these rules. I mean, learn how to read and you'll be able to read any book in your language. But every game has different rules, different goals, different play styles. Playing Tetris isn't going to make you good at playing Pac-Man, nor will your Mario Kart skills translate into Call of Duty. So then, video games have to teach us how to play the game if we're to experience it properly. After all, if we don't know how to play a game, then we're likely just gonna get confused and annoyed, and we'll stop playing pretty quickly. Older games used to teach us how to play the games by including the rules in the manuals, but more recently we've started to take a more streamlined approach by teaching the player how to play the game in the game itself. But that presents a new challenge in and of itself. Specifically in regards to narrative, since that's what this show is about, a video game is now tasked with not only the basic narrative requirements of starting a story, like the relevant exposition and development of the world before the story kicks into gear, but also with teaching the player how to even experience the work in the first place. And this can be incredibly difficult to do without just completely breaking the flow of both the story and the gameplay early on. I'm sure we've all played a game that starts off with an awkward bit where the story just kind of grinds to a halt so some NPC can tell us what buttons to push, or even screens that just pop up out of nowhere to tell us how to play the game, completely breaking the whole introduction. These methods are effective, but they're not particularly conducive to good pacing, or even learning. So then, how does Portal manage this? Well, GLaDOS definitely plays a role, since she's there to inform you of the basics throughout the first few test chambers, but following that, it's actually very cleverly laid out using some incredibly nuanced game design. The designers knew that the whole concept of Portal was very outside the way we humans normally think, so they introduced each element of the game with a level of care and purpose that would probably seem overbearing in any other game, but they do it by integrating each new concept into a puzzle. You can see how the first room introduces the basic concept of portals. The second introduces the idea of portals moving around. The third gives you control over one of the portals. You get the idea. For a full examination of how the first few test chambers work as a tutorial, check out the Extra Credits Design Club episode on the subject. Basically anything made by the team over at Extra Credits is worth your time, really. The point is that Portal uses very careful and intentional game design to teach the player how the game works, which allows those lessons to be integrated into the game itself without actually interrupting the flow of the story at all.
In layman's terms, speedy thing goes in, speedy thing comes out.
If you play through the whole game with this in mind, and consider what new concept each room is teaching you, it's actually very impressive. It's certainly an example a lot more games could stand to follow. Anyway, now that you've escaped the testing, all that's left is to get out. You navigate your way through the far less sterile hallways of the facility proper, and it becomes clear, again through the brilliant environmental storytelling, that the place has been abandoned for a long time. Signs of life still exist, such as eternally looping slideshows and clipboards scattered across vacant desks, but there's no one, no bodies even, to be found. GLaDOS begs for you to return, but again, you're kind of out of her area of surveillance and influence, so that's really all she can do.
We are pleased that you made it through the final challenge where we pretended we were going to murder you. We are very happy for your success. We are throwing a party in honor of your tremendous success. Place the device on the ground, then lie on your stomach with your arms at your sides.
You use everything you've learned so far to work your way through the facility and dodge what traps GLaDOS is able to set. When you finally find her, she explains.
Good news. I figured out what that thing you just incinerated did. It was a morality core they installed after I flooded the enrichment center with a deadly neurotoxin to make me stop flooding the enrichment center with a deadly neurotoxin. So get comfortable while I warm up the neurotoxin emitters.
And in a final encounter that, like most good boss fights, uses a variety of techniques you learn to test your skills, you defeat GLaDOS by destroying bits of her computer system. Hilarious bits of her computer system.
Who are you? What is that? Oh, what's that? What's that? What is that? Oh, that thing has numbers on it. Hey, look at that thing. No, that other thing. What's wrong with your legs? Where are we going? Are you coming back? Oh hey, you're the lady from the test. Hi.
In the end, you're dumped up above ground amidst the ruins of an Aperture Science building and treated to one of the most famous songs in the entire medium of video games.
This was a triumph. I'm making a note here, huge success. It's hard to overstate my satisfaction.
Still Alive isn't particularly relevant to this video, but I just have to take a second to say that it is awesome. It uses the same kind of cheery yet foreboding tone of humor that the whole rest of the game does. It's part of what makes it so enjoyable. This song is just a ton of fun. But alright, time to get into it. As I mentioned earlier, Portal doesn't have as much strength in its narrative as it does in how that narrative is told to us, so I'm just going to give a brief overview of the major themes of the story before I go on to talk about the first-person perspective and the projection protagonist. The basic themes at play in Portal are ones of freedom, obedience, and the tension between humanity and machinated process. GLaDOS is just doing tests. In her clear-cut, programmed understanding of reality, Chell is just the subject of that test. A tool, essentially, with which to gain results. In a system like GLaDOS is trying to run, each tool serves its function and contributes to the smooth operation of the whole. But humans don't necessarily work like that. We have desires, needs, motivations, so GLaDOS has learned to manipulate her test subjects with promises of freedom and reward. Were it not for her disregard for your safety and her rather humorous inability to keep from making ominous or threatening remarks, she probably would have done a fine job convincing us of that. It probably also would have helped if she hadn't decided to experiment on human emotion by making us carry a companion cube around before dumping it into an incinerator. And that's a noteworthy element of Portal, though one I won't spend too much time on. It uses humor very well. It's not just there to get a cheap laugh. It's actually a major element of the atmosphere and foreshadowing. GLaDOS clearly doesn't have the clearest understanding of human interaction and psychology. Like she read a textbook, but being a machine has no actual first-hand experience with it. This results in a lot of comments that essentially amount to poor cover-ups of her true intentions. Her flippant disregard for your safety, stated in the context of a carefully controlled environment and paired with her matter-of-fact tone, create a dissonance that simultaneously makes us laugh and makes us rather suspicious of her true intentions.
Please note that we have added a consequence for failure. Any contact with the chamber floor will result in an unsatisfactory mark on your official testing record, followed by death. Good luck.
Anyway, the story is essentially a story of man versus, well, woman in this case, versus machine. Machine tries to control everything in a rigid and orderly fashion to the detriment of woman. Woman refuses to be an obedient cog in this machine's plan and eventually uses that plan against it. But this is a tale as old as time, really. Is there anything else to Portal's story? Well, not really. At least not without some hefty interpretation. The deepest and most cohesive interpretation I've seen actually referred to Portal as a, what was the wording there? An interactive showcase of how language is used in performances to manage institutional processes. It's pretty interesting. I'll just leave the link down in the description. Point is, when it comes down to it, getting anything too deep from Portal's narrative requires a lot of symbolic interpretation and reading into the work far more than was clearly intended, which is fine, of course, but we really don't have time for that and talking about how its storytelling is accomplished, so maybe we'll return to that in a later episode. Now, we've covered the environmental storytelling and the tutorial, but there's one more very important storytelling tool in Portal's arsenal: perspective, and how it's used with our projection protagonist. The first-person perspective in video games functions very similarly to the first-person perspective in other literature, but it's far more visual. It literally means the game is seen in first person, that you're looking through the theoretical eyes of your protagonist. From a gameplay perspective, it helps a lot with precision, as looking literally down the sights of a weapon you're firing simply makes aiming more natural and precise compared to a camera hovering around a character. From a storytelling perspective, its main function is to increase immersion by making you feel as though you're actually directly in the shoes of the player character. Immersion is a tricky subject, just because it works in so many different ways in so many different games for so many different people, but the basic concept is that it's the feeling of being completely, well, immersed in an experience. I mean, it happens in books and movies too, not just video games. Like that book that you just cannot put down, or the movie that so enraptures you entirely that you don't even think to eat your snacks for the entire thing. In video games, there's an added layer to this immersion because, as with many elements of this medium, you are in control. The character is responding as you would, and you have a responsibility to react well to whatever's going on and whatever you come across. It makes you feel even more like you're actually there, because you're a direct part of what's going on. The first-person perspective is ideal for this kind of moment-by-moment immersion, simply because you're seeing and interacting with the world literally through the eyes of the character you're playing as. In this way, it's also one of the best ways for video games to present the main character as you. Like, actually you, in this vessel of a character. This isn't something unique to Portal, but it's the perfect opportunity to talk about this in more detail. Remember the concept of the projection protagonist? We talked about it a couple episodes ago. The idea is that it's a character that's made with little to no real character development, so the player can easily just step into their shoes and experience the game vicariously through them. Chell is a textbook example. Aside from the fact that she's a woman, which, not counting the art games, makes half the games I've analyzed on this show ones with female protagonists, which is actually kind of neat, the player doesn't know anything about her, really. What little we get from GLaDOS could easily be a lie. I don't think teasing her for being an orphan counts as reliable exposition, especially when she also teases her for being fat. At least I really hope Chell's body type doesn't qualify as fat in the Portal universe. Chell is a classic silent protagonist. Her character is minimally developed, and she never says a word, so her actions are the only defining elements of her character. We're never sure how she feels about all this, or what she's thinking about it all, or whether she even thinks of escaping before the option is presented, or really more like forced upon her. All we know about Chell is what she does in the game, but actions aren't alone in the ways that they define a person. They reflect certain things. They imply motivations, feelings, and values. And the cool thing about a character like Chell is that there's nothing in the way of conflating her character with our own. Her motivations, feelings, and her values are ours. For all intents and purposes, we are her. An interesting element of this is how it changes Chell's character depending on the circumstances of your game. The first time you play through, the player is usually more cautious. They're learning how the game works and what dangers there are. As this translates to Chell, her character becomes one of caution or timidity. It's about learning and survival. But on following playthroughs, Chell has a rather different character because the player knows what to do and what will happen. Chell now flies through the traps without caution. She has become extremely confident. The player is starting to test boundaries, to see how fast they can go and how well they can do. In a book or a movie, this kind of lack of character development would just result in a really boring protagonist, but add interactivity. Make it so the player is actively taking on the role of this character, and instead we have a character who's just seamlessly open to interpretation. We don't even think about why this character is doing what she's doing, because really her motivations are our motivations. Filling in these blanks just comes naturally to us as we take on this active role in the story. This is one of those areas in which video games hand some of the narrative artistry over to the player. The argument that the player becomes the storyteller is in most cases something of a stretch, but their involvement cannot be ignored. This game, and others like it, seamlessly allow the player to be an active part of the story, essentially sacrificing character development for a feeling of agency and involvement in the narrative. This approach puts you into a story, rather than relaying one to you. That's the power of interactivity, the unique thing that video games offer to the world of art and storytelling. And while Portal's story is a simple one, it knows how to insert the player into it. And that's one of its biggest strengths. So that's Portal. Since this is an analysis specifically of the game's interactive narrative elements, I didn't get to talk nearly as much as I would certainly like to about the game's brilliant game structure and all of the creative ideas that are at the heart of this game, but when it comes down to it, there is extensive study out there on those topics by people far more qualified than I to talk about them. As an interactive story, Portal uses a good few interactive devices to help build mystery and atmosphere, then uses both the game's design and the player's interaction to slowly reveal the secrets of its narrative. And now that you've seen it in Portal, I guarantee you'll see these same concepts used all over the place in this medium. So with that said, I'd love to see what you think in the comments. Next week, we're beginning a 3-part series on adaptation, what it is, how it works, and why video games seem to be so terrible at it. And next month on Literary Analysis, it's time to take a look at a deceptively simple-seeming tale about colored blocks and friendship. So until next time, this has been Games as Lit 101, and class is dismissed. Hey, where the heck?
This was a triumph. I'm making a note here, huge success. It's hard to overstate my satisfaction. Aperture science. We do what we must because we can. For the good of all of us, except the ones who are dead. But there's no sense crying over every mistake. You just keep on trying till you run out of cake. And the science gets done and you make a neat gun for the people who are still alive.
Wheatley will help.
I don't want Wheatley's help. No!